The field at Castillon has gone quiet. Boughs lie broken in the mud, and the archers who carried them will not rise again. Today, in a single afternoon, close to 300 cannon ended a weapon that had ruled Europe's battlefields for 100 years. Not another army of archers, not knights, but guns dug into the earth behind a wall of timber and dirt. At Crécy, at Agincourt, this same weapon turned armored knights into corpses and made English peasant bowmen the terror of Europe. This is Castillon, the 17th of July, 1453. The day England's oldest weapon finally met something it could not outshoot. By the time the smoke clears, the war that made English archers legends will be over. How did the army that broke France at Crécy and Agincourt collapse in one afternoon? Not from a shortage of men, but from a shortage of the right weapon. By 1453, the 100 Years' War had run for over a century, and for most of it, one weapon had decided the outcome. At Crécy, English longbowmen had cut down the flower of French chivalry from 300 yards. At Agincourt, they had done it again, turning a muddy field into a killing ground for armored knights who could barely walk in the mire, let alone fight. At Verneuil, the story repeated a third time. 3 generations of English commanders had learned the same lesson. Put bowmen on a good position, let the enemy come, and watch them die at range. It had never really failed. But by this point in the war, the ground beneath that confidence had shifted. France under Charles VII had spent the better part of 2 decades rebuilding. Reclaiming Normandy in the north, pushing south into Gascony, tightening the noose around English holdings in France that had lasted, in some form, since the 12th century, when the marriage of Eleanor of Aquitaine had first bound the region to the English crown. Gascony was not just territory. It was the oldest English possession on the continent, its wine trade a lifeline for both sides, and its loyalty had never fully bent toward Paris. Bordeaux, the last great English stronghold left standing, had surrendered the year before. Then its citizens, still loyal to the English crown, still dependent on English merchants, invited the English back rather than live under French rule. John Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury, an English commander in his 60s with decades of campaigning already behind him, landed with a force to retake the city and hold the region one more time. Talbot moved fast, almost recklessly fast for a man his age. Chroniclers describe him as one of England's most feared field commanders, the sort of name the French had used to frighten children for a generation. He recaptured Bordeaux itself within days of landing, then pushed toward the nearby town of Castillon, where a French force under Jean Bureau, master of the Royal Artillery, had settled in and begun a siege of its own. Bureau was not a knight. He was a technical officer, an administrator who had spent years building France's gunpowder arm almost from nothing, gathering foundries, gunners, and powder makers under royal patronage while the old nobility still measured a man's worth by his horse and his lance. Few on the English side thought his guns worth losing sleep over. And this is where the fatal assumption took hold. As Talbot's advance guard approached, word reached him that the French camp was breaking up. Smoke rising above the tents, wagons pulling away, the unmistakable commotion of an army abandoning its position. It was not a retreat. It was townspeople and camp followers clearing out of the area for their own safety before the fighting began. A normal precaution mistaken for panic. But to a commander who had spent his career watching the English longbow win every open engagement it entered, who had personally seen French forces crumble under arrow fire more than once, the signs read exactly like what he expected to see: an enemy losing its nerve at the mere approach of an English army. Talbot did not wait for the 5,000 infantry marching up the road behind him, still hours away. He ordered his advance force, roughly 1,000 mounted men, forward, straight toward a position no English commander had ever faced before, and no English weapon had ever been tested against. What Talbot's scouts could see from a distance was a camp behind a ditch and a timber palisade. Unremarkable, the kind of field fortification any siege force might raise. What they could not see was what Jean and his brother Gaspard Bureau had spent weeks building inside it. The Bureau brothers were not battlefield romantics. Jean had spent years as a royal administrator before turning his full attention to artillery. And under his direction, France had assembled something no army in Europe had fielded at this scale. Close to 300 guns of every size, from massive siege bombards down to smaller field pieces called voglaires and culverins, each dug into a prepared position with its angle of fire already measured, its crew already drilled. The exact count is debated. Some accounts say more than 200, but every source agrees on the same picture. An entrenched wall of gunpowder, hidden behind earth and timber, aimed at open ground the English would have to cross to reach it. This was the open question the French camp posed and never answered aloud. How many guns were actually waiting behind that fence? Not one English officer riding toward Castillon that morning could have told you. The garrison had more than guns. Roughly 7,000 to 9,000 men held the camp itself, gunners and infantry packed behind the earthworks, while Breton cavalry, close to 1,000 strong, waited apart to strike any force that broke against the palisade, ready to hit the flank the moment English lines lost their shape. It was a defensive system built for exactly one purpose: to punish an attacker who came in fast, in the open, without artillery of his own to answer. None of this was improvised. Jean Bureau had been refining French gunpowder tactics for years, learning from earlier campaigns where cannon had proven decisive against static defenses. Castillon inverted the usual role of siege artillery. Instead of guns breaking down a fortress wall, they were dug in behind one, waiting for the enemy to attack them. It was a role reversal few soldiers on either side had ever seen, and fewer still would have recognized it for what it was until the first volley fired. And that was precisely the kind of attack the English longbow had always delivered before. For 100 years, the bow's advantage had been range and rate of fire against men on foot or on horse, in open country, with nothing but their own armor between them and the arrows. Nothing, in Talbot's experience. Not Crécy, not Agincourt, not any battle fought in his own lifetime, had prepared him for a fortified gun line he could not outrange, could not outshoot, and could not see the true size of until his men were already inside its arc of fire. Talbot's advance guard reached the camp first. Roughly 1,000 mounted men, riding ahead of the infantry, still marching up the road behind them. Lord Lisle, Talbot's own son, rode among the vanguard, close to his father as always. As they closed on the palisade, the answer to the open question finally came. And it came all at once. The guns did not fire one at a time. They fired in belts, one battery after another, angles preset, crews already drilled to reload without pause. Close to 300 barrels. The exact number is debated. Some accounts say more than 200. Turned the approach into a corridor of iron, heavy bombards for the killing range, smaller voglaires and culverins to cover the ground closer in, each type positioned exactly where Bureau's gunners had judged it would do the most damage. This was nothing like the open fields of Crécy or Agincourt, where longbowmen had stood behind stakes and simply outranged whatever came at them across empty ground. Here, there was no range advantage to hold. The English were riding directly at fixed positions, into fire that did not stop to let them close the distance on their own terms. The very kind of terms that had won every English battle before this one. Men and horses went down in the first minutes, not from arrows or lances, but from shot tearing through the front ranks before they had even reached the ditch. Formation broke almost immediately. Some riders pressed on regardless, driven forward by momentum and by the sheer difficulty of turning a charging horse mid-stride under fire. Others tried to pull back and collided with the ranks still coming up behind them, turning an advance into a tangle of horses with nowhere to go. Modern historians who have studied the battle describe Castillon as one of the first engagements in Western Europe decided primarily by field artillery rather than by infantry or cavalry shock. A reversal of roles the English had no template for. The camp's ditch and palisade meant the guns themselves were never seriously threatened. The English could not reach the barrels fast enough, in enough numbers, to silence even one battery before the next volley came. Every tactic that had once carried English arms through France, speed of advance, discipline under fire, the raw psychological weight of a charge, ran straight into a wall of gunpowder that did not care how bravely it was faced. Then the Breton cavalry hit the flank. It came exactly when the English line was at its most disordered. Men trying to reform under fire, others already falling back, the whole advance guard caught between the guns ahead and cavalry closing in from the side. There was no orderly retreat left to organize. The position collapsed from the inside out, and what had been an attacking force only minutes earlier became a crowd of men trying to survive in ground the French had chosen for exactly this purpose. Talbot himself did not survive it. Accounts describe his horse struck down by cannon fire, pinning him beneath it in the chaos of the collapse. He was killed on the field, along with his own son, Lord Lisle, fighting at his side. A third English commander, Kendall, was taken prisoner as the position gave way entirely. The man whose reputation alone had once been enough to unsettle French garrisons for a generation, died in the mud beneath his own horse, cut down by a weapon he had never had serious reason to fear before this single afternoon. By the time the infantry Talbot had left behind finally reached the field, there was nothing left to reinforce. The battle, such as it was, had already been decided in the time it took roughly 1,000 riders to cross open ground toward a fence they could not see through. What made Castillon different from every English defeat before it was not courage, and it was not numbers. It was that, for the first time in this war, English soldiers rode into a fixed line of massed artillery and discovered that speed, discipline, and a legendary weapon meant nothing against fire that could reach them before they were close enough to reach back. The longbow that had made English archers untouchable at range had no answer for guns dug into the earth behind a wooden fence. It simply never got the chance to matter. When the smoke finally cleared, the ground in front of the palisade was littered with English dead, and the camp Talbot had ridden toward that morning, certain it was already beaten, had not moved an inch. The guns fell silent. What they had just decided was only beginning to show itself. The numbers told their own story, and there was very little room in them for doubt. English losses ran to roughly 4,000 men. French losses, by comparison, came to something close to 100, a gap so wide it is almost a bare statistic rather than a battle report. Chroniclers of the period, along with modern historians who have re-examined the sources, agree the imbalance was extraordinary, even by the standards of a war that had already produced its share of one-sided results. Around the palisade, the field told the rest of it without needing words. English archers and men-at-arms lay where they had fallen, some still short of the ditch they had been riding toward when the first volley found them. Boughs lay scattered in the mud beside the men who had carried them across half of France for 100 years, never once beaten this badly, this fast, by anything they had faced before. The guns that had done this stood cold now, smoke drifting off the barrels, the gunners who had fired them still standing behind the same fence they had never once needed to leave. Not a single French position had been overrun. The palisade bureau had built weeks earlier stood exactly where it had always stood. The turning point is next, because Castillon was never really about one battlefield. Bordeaux, the city Talbot had come to save, could not hold without him. Its garrison had lost the field army meant to protect it, and within a few months, in October of that same year, the city surrendered to French forces for the last time. There would be no third English return. What had just been decided in a single afternoon outside Castillon was about to close out a war that had run for over a century. There was no treaty signed at Castillon, no formal document to mark the end. But historians generally treat this battle as the last major engagement of the 100 Years' War. The moment the fighting effectively stopped, even if the war itself was never formally closed on paper, England kept Calais, a single foothold across the Channel. Everything else on the continent, including the Gascony its kings had held for 3 centuries, going back to Eleanor of Aquitaine, was gone for good. What if Talbot had waited for his infantry, 5,000 men still marching up an empty road? No one can say with certainty. But the guns would still have been there, still dug in, still aimed at open ground. The weight might have changed the odds. It would not have changed the wall in front of him. So the question the hook left open finds its answer here. The longbow did not fail because it had grown weak. It failed because, for the first time, it met a weapon it could not outrange. Sitting behind a fence, it could not simply walk around. That is the leading interpretation, and the sources support it. Though historians are also quick to note that the longbow's long decline in the decades after Castillon had other causes too. The cost of training a lifelong archer, the slow rise of standing professional armies, the spread of gunpowder weapons far beyond this one battlefield. Castillon did not kill the longbow everywhere. It killed it here, on this field, in this single afternoon, at the exact place where the era it had opened at Crécy finally closed. The cannon that ended the 100 Years' War abroad would soon find a new kind of war to answer for. One fought not for French soil, but for the English crown itself.